All right, we're continuing our study of leadership. We're in the 10th lesson. We're talking about getting the work done. We'll get to that here in just a second. I want to mention a class that begins Sunday because we forgot to mention this past Sunday. It's been on the scrolling ads that we put up on Sunday morning and Sunday night before the sermon. By the way, those ads will have dates that are important to all of us. We'll have meeting dates as they're scheduled, those kind of things, so pay attention to those as you can. But we failed to mention this past Sunday. This is a sermon and invitation preparation class that starts Sunday at 4. And we'll have 4 of those classes, and then we'll schedule some things spasmodically beyond that. We were asked if we could do some of this, but here's where we want to clarify. We're not expecting every man to come to that. So if you don't come, we're not excited because you didn't show up for the class. It's for those that want or need some help in preparation and delivery of sermons and invitations. So we're going to start with some of the basics and the mechanics of how to put that together and then how to deliver that. And if you're interested in that, whether you think you will ever do that or not, or you're already doing that, then you may want to come to that class. We'll try to record that, preserve that for those who can't make that. But anyway, we'll mention that again later Sunday morning. But anyway, that's going on Sunday at 4. All right, let's talk about leadership. Our purpose in this series, and I keep reminding you this, and there's a reason for doing that, as to what our purpose is behind this. And quite frequently, sometimes in a study like this, of this kind of nature of study, we may get halfway through with that and someone wonder, well, why are we studying this kind of material for everybody when we've mentioned it every time? And so I keep reminding, and at one point it'll hit somebody, and at some other point it'll hit somebody else. This is the value that it is for us. But we're trying to develop future leaders, both in the near future and in the distant future, and also prepare wives for what their husbands who may be in leadership may be involved in and what they may be doing. But also help all of us to understand what leaders go through, the scenarios they deal with, and the challenges they may face. And one of the reasons for doing that is toward the end of this, or the beginning of the year, end of December, 1st of January, we're going to ask you to submit names, not to be immediately appointed, but names, and we'll give the details of that a little bit later, who may be in that 1 to 3 years or 3 to 5 year period of being ready. And what we're looking for there is for you to suggest John Doe is ready if he were to do X, Y, Z, that he'd work on that area. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. And so this class may help us get ready for that, is our hope. We're ready for lesson number 10, which means most of these lessons are behind us. The majority of them are behind us, so we have 7 more to go after this. These 2 lessons, 9 and 10, deal with getting the work done, so we're finishing that concept up tonight. About accomplishing the work, we've dealt with visions, plans, and answers that leaders must develop, but then they must execute the plan. In our introduction last time, we made these points, and I remind you of this, and that is that leaders must be men of action. They do more than plan and discuss, that they must execute the plans. Without executing the plans, that means their visions and their plans and their answers then are going to be worthless if they're not executed or carried out. We mentioned also that too often great ideas or plans fail, or at least are delayed, because we either drag our feet or we lose the enthusiasm, we don't finish the task, we're not motivated. Several things we're talking about in this series. We also made the point that there are 2 things required to get anything done, and that is, 1, you get started, and secondly, you don't stop, you don't quit, you keep moving. That's true of living the Christian life, that's true of parenting, that's true of leadership, various other principles. Those have to be done. Here are the 4 things we're talking about here. 2 of those we've already dealt with, and I'm going to remind you of those. And we started with leaders must be prompt, is what we talked about last time. And in that regard, we made 3 points. We made that we must get to the task of getting the work done. And like the prophets of old, what was the phrase used with the prophets of old, particularly and peculiar to Jeremiah? Yeah. They rose up early, the prophet said. That was peculiar to the book of Jeremiah. This means eagerness. It may have involved getting up in the early hours of the morning, but it gave more the idea of the eagerness to the task more than the time of the day. But they got up early to the task. God is even said to rise early to a task. And that's also found in the book of Jeremiah. We mentioned the idea of not procrastinating, and then we got to this concept of managing our time. And that is, we need to schedule and get things accomplished. Here's what we want to do. Here's our goal. We want to manage our time. Now, after class, Shannon Stewart mentioned something to me that I want to introduce to you, and he's going to develop that for us here in a moment. When you have tasks before you, this would be true if you're an executive or if you're a leader in a business, if you're a leader in church, whatever, that what tasks are before you may fall into one of two categories. Above this line are things that are important. Below the line is not important. Doesn't mean it's not important at all. And Shannon's going to explain this in just a moment for us. And then on the left of that would be things that are urgent. And over here, things that are not urgent. And so here's how you develop that. Tell us about this, Shannon.
Yeah, I found this was a very helpful tool, something that was brought to me actually in a corporate meeting that I was a part of about a month ago. But I found it really interesting to manage your time, to divert, to split things into if they're important or not important. That carries the concept of, is this something that requires my skill set, or is this something that's a more menial task that can be accomplished by any person? That's something that could be delegated, or is it something that does require my skill set? Urgency versus not urgent requires us to think about a task and divide it into, is this a time-sensitive task? I found this really helpful because you can kind of divide and get an idea of what to do with what task. Is this something is urgent and important? That is something that's a fire that's got to be put out right away. I got to do that. It's something I've got to take care of immediately. Is this something that is not urgent, it's not time sensitive, but it's important for me to do? Well, that's something I'm going to schedule. And as a leader, we spend the vast majority of our time in that second box, that yellow box, and we're taking care of being proactive with our time. We're scheduling things the way we should, being thoughtful ahead of time. Because if we spend all of our time in that green box, then that means everything's a fire. We're never thinking of things ahead of time. If we spend all of our time doing actions in the red box, we're just wasting our time. If we're spending all of our time in that blue box, we're doing things that we feel are super important or urgent, that they require our time sensitivity. But those are things we could have other people doing for us. So we're once again spinning our wheels. We need to spend our time in that yellow box.
Good point. One of the and I wanted Shannon to deal with that because he's familiar with that, and also he knew the colors and I didn't. So, but one of the things I find sometimes, whether it's in the work of preaching or in the work of leadership or work of eldership, here's something that needs to be done. As Shannon said, there's a fire that's got to be put out right now. But other things that is not a fire may get put off and not scheduled. And we're going to talk a little about that we need to schedule that because it needs to be done, and we need to schedule a time. Because if we just say sometime, what happens to the sometimes? Never comes. We never find those days. All right, one of the things we dealt with last time was leaders must be self-motivated, and that too many leaders are lacking that motivation, and we must be motivated and be self-motivated and have self-discipline, self-control. All right, let's finish this study by looking at two more things about getting the work done, and that is leaders must delegate. Why? All right, absolutely. Leaders can't do everything themselves. There are some things, as Shannon just mentioned, that require the leader's skill set or maybe their authority to deal with. And so they have to deal with that. They can't delegate that. But there are other things that have to be delegated because they can't do everything. All right, what else would you say? All right. All right, it allows you to train others. Why delegate? All right, gets others not only involved in doing, but buying into the project or whatever it is that we're doing. It may be something concerning the building or maybe something concerning teaching.
Where you can delegate so you can do other things.
All right, so other things could be done. Yes, some jobs require some skill or knowledge that the leader may not have. Just because you're in leadership doesn't mean you know how to do everything that needs to be done. There may be things involved in carrying out the work of preaching that you may not know about the mechanics of the audiovisual, for example, but there may be somebody that's skilled in that can see to all of that, where the leaders may not have a clue how any of that works. Make sense? Same thing in business and any other field. Let's go to Acts chapter 6. We'll make reference to this time and again because it is a principle of leadership in a number of areas that we'll talk about. If we don't delegate, then leaders get bogged down, as this suggests here, with a task that take away from their real work. That doesn't mean what's being delegated is an unimportant task. It's just a different kind of task. So let's go to Acts chapter 6. What's going on in Acts 6? 1 to 6. All right, yes, here were widows that were being neglected in the daily distribution. That is, here was the church being involved in taking care of some widows on a daily basis, and there were some who had been neglected, which seems to imply there may be an overwhelming circumstance where someone was slighted or overlooked. So the leaders, this case is the apostles, asked the congregation to select 7 men whom we, the apostles, may appoint over that business. So are the apostles giving up any authority? Okay, they're delegating. Why'd you say no? Yeah. Yes, they haven't given up their authority as apostles. They still have authority over the church, don't they? They're still apostles. They haven't given up their apostleship. They haven't given up their apostolic authority at all, have they? No. But they're delegating so that someone else takes the work that needs to be done of seeing to these widows. Now, what was the wording found here? Whom we may appoint. Yes, that we may give ourselves to fasting and prayer. Now notice at verse 2, it is not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Is serving tables such a menial task that the apostles shouldn't be bothered? No, that's not the point. It's not that they are too good to serve tables. But notice that we may appoint them over this business, but we ourselves, I'm at verse 4, will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. In other words, we have the task of doing the work of apostles that God appointed the apostles to do. Let's appoint some other men who need to be qualified, who we can delegate to take care of this matter. Does that make sense? So here's a biblical principle of delegating so that those in leadership can go on with their real work. It's the opportunities already mentioned to include others. Now, leadership and delegating that principle of some responsibility should not be used as a substitute for leaders' responsibility. What would we mean by that?
When you delegate, you're delegating also, you're not giving them the responsibility, but you're giving them the authority to complete the task that is assigned to them.
All right.
But all the overall responsibility falls back on the original person that delegated, which would be the apostles in this case.
Okay, good point. Somebody said something over here.
They're still making sure the work gets done.
Right. Still overseeing that. Nixon said in his book on leaders, he had a number of interesting quotes in that. In the final analysis, delegation can never be a substitute for any leaders thinking a problem through or making the key decisions on major issues. Just because you're delegating doesn't take away the responsibility. Let's go back to the apostles in Acts 6. When they delegate that, did that remove the apostles in having some oversight and seeing that it got done? Not at all. Not at all. What if these 7 didn't take care of that? Who does it come back to? Ultimately the apostles, because we are to appoint them over this business is the point. Now, I'm not trying to get into politics, but this is 2 different styles of leadership. If you remember the days, some of you are not old enough to remember the days of Carter and Reagan, but Reagan was a man who delegated, but Carter got bogged down, whether you liked him or not or thought he was great or not. He got bogged down because he didn't delegate as much as he should. He tried to take too many decisions on himself, if you'll remember. And so there's 2 different styles of leadership. Now, I've always found this interesting. Eisenhower, when he was a general, 5-star general, said that one of the hardest things he had to learn as an executive was how to sign a bad letter. What does that mean?
But he had more important things to do, and as long as he doesn't convey the main idea, he needed to leave it in the hands of the person he came.
Yeah, he didn't have time to rewrite it. Good point, good point. That's exactly it. He could write it much better, but somebody had written a letter for him that's going to have his name on it as if he wrote it, and he had to sign it. He said that was the hardest thing to learn to do. When you could do it better, but you've delegated it to somebody else and you've got to sign off on that. Well, that's part of the difficulty, and we're going to deal with some difficulties of delegation here in a moment. Leadership involves taking and bearing responsibility and seeing the work gets done. Apostles, Acts 6, saw that the widows were cared for. Delegation involves transferring authority and details to someone else. Make sense? All right. So if a leader can't delegate, then he needs to look at whether or not he's a good leader. Let's look at some examples of delegation. Let's go to Moses. We've talked about Moses in the past. By the in the past, I mean in this past series of studies. So let's go to Exodus 18. Who advised him he needed some help? His father-in-law. Very good. Yeah, his father-in-law told him, you take too much for yourself. We're not going to read every verse because we're familiar with the story because we've alluded to that before. Verse 14, his father-in-law said to him, what is this thing that you're doing for the people? Why do you sit alone? I'm at verse 14, Exodus 18. And all the people stand before you from morning to evening. Drop down to verse 18. Both you and the people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. You can't do it all, Moses. You can't do it by yourself. You need some help. Drop down to 21. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers. In other words, they need to be qualified men who can be trusted. And you appoint them over them to be rulers. So you're giving them some authority. Now let's drop down from verse 20. That was at verse 21. 22, and let them judge the people at all times, and then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you. In other words, let them deal with things that they can handle, but if it gets to the point that it requires a difficult task or difficult decision, let them bring it to you. And so you're dealing with the bad problems, the real problems, and let them deal with various other things. Now drop down to verse 25. So Moses chose able men and made them heads over all the people. And then the last verse we take note of is verse 26. And so they judged all the people, and the hard cases they brought to Moses. And so he delegated the judging down to others. Does that mean Moses lost his authority? No. He just delegated. Make sense? All right, let's notice another example of that, of delegating. Nehemiah chapter 3. I'm not going to read any verses there. What do you remember from Nehemiah 3? Absolutely. That's one of those, quote, boring chapters when you get to, because it just says this family and this family and this family and this family and this family, and you can't even half pronounce the names, work from this gate to this gate. What does that tell you? It tells me he delegated. He assigned this family, you work here, and this family, you work here, and this family, you work here, and this family. He delegated the work. That's how he got it done. Because Nehemiah could not have built the entire wall by himself, could he? Overwhelming task. So he was a delegator. That's why we mention him as a great leader and a great ruler. And so we mention again the apostles in Acts 6. They delegated. So here's the principle of delegating. Both in the Old and New Testament, leaders did do that. Now, what does delegating involve? It involves giving authority to another to act. You're not surrendering your authority. You're just simply giving them the authority to take the action and fulfill that action. Delegating involves turning a task or responsibility over to another so that they own that task. What does it mean they own the task?
It's specifically assigned to them.
All right. They take responsibility for it. Very good. Say again. Don't micromanage. Yes. They're held accountable. These are all good comments. We tell our deacons sometimes, you own this job, this task. Meaning you're responsible for it. You take care of it. It's your baby. And we don't need to go and have micromanage and tell them every move to make, nor do they need to come and ask us every minor decision to make. Does that make sense? You own that task. You take care of that. You take care of maybe even delegating some of that out if you need to. Furthermore, delegating involves letting the one delegated see to the details rather than give them the details. If you're going to micromanage, you're not delegating very much. It's authorizing another to make some decisions within what the leaders have authorized. Make sense? You make decisions within that realm. It may be, here is a budget you have for this project of maybe painting the building, and you make the decisions where you get to paint, the kind of paint, and who you're going to get to paint, but this is your budget. And don't micromanage. Make sense? That's what's involved. Now, elders delegate to deacons and other members. And so I want to quickly mention this because I want to get to our next point. Elders have authority and oversight. Larry dealt with that in the lesson he dealt with a couple of weeks ago. Deacons are servants that I'm not convinced 100% those were deacons in the same sense of 1 Timothy 3, but if you think they were, then I'll go along with that. Same word, by the way. It just simply means servant. These were special servants in Acts chapter 6. So deacons are, that's what the word deacon means, is they are servants. But here's what I wanted to get to. That there are others besides deacons who are under the oversight of elders, 1 Peter 5, who might be appointed to a task there and not be in the role of being a deacon as such. An example, Phoebe, Romans 16:1, was said to be a servant of the church at Cenchrea. Same word for deacon, but I don't think she met the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3. In fact, I'm pretty sure she didn't because she was not a man. But she was a servant of the church. Could the elders appoint a woman to see to some task? Yeah, we do that in teaching a Bible class. I used to work for a congregation where the elders had a lot of correspondence they were involved in and a number of other tasks, and they basically, she wasn't hired, they paid her to do secretarial work for the elders, and she did. Yeah, put a directory together. So there may be a special task that elders delegate to somebody that may not be a deacon, but this person is well qualified to deal with that aspect. Make sense? So those who are appointed need to be responsible people. We saw that in the case of Exodus 18. We see that in Acts 6, who we don't have to keep checking on to see if the work is being done. Thus the qualifications. Make sense? All right, one other thing I want to mention on that delegating is not always easy. Why would I say that? Looks like it would just be easy. We got some work to do, you do it. Done. All right, sometimes finding the right person for the task makes it difficult.
Sometimes it's hard to turn over responsibility to someone else, whether you have something like OCD where you want to be in charge of trying to micromanage, or whether you have issues of trusting other people.
All right. It might be, very good, it might be that I don't want to have to sign a bad letter because I can write it better, so I don't want to turn loose of that. That could be the case. It may involve a task that I think I can do myself, or I may think I could do it better. I don't mean me as Donnie, I mean me as a leader, whoever the leader may be. Put yourself in that place. It may be hard because the task may not be a fun task. I hate to really ask somebody to do this because this isn't a fun task. It would be a whole lot better to be involved in the administering of the word than serving tables, Acts 6. So I hate to ask people to do that. Or it may be because I hate to ask because this seems like a lowlier task, and I hate to ask people to do a lower task when I'm going to be fulfilling a higher task. Does that make sense? Or it may be hard because the person being delegated may not be real happy with doing the job. I was preaching in a place one time, not as a regular preacher, but in a meeting where I asked one of the elders, could you get a deacon to get the projector out? This was back in the overhead projector days, because I want to use it. And he looked around and he said, well, I'm trying to think of a deacon that won't complain about being asked, so I'll just do it myself. So he did. He was. But the point is that sometimes those being appointed may complain about what they're appointed to. That makes it even harder to delegate. Make sense? All right. Let's talk about leaders must be finishers, and then we'll go to our scenario for tonight. It's easy to start a task and then quit. Let's give biblical evidence of that. What was said to the Galatians in Galatians 5? I like the King James rendering of this, by the way. He said, you did run well. Who did hinder you? Pictures it as a race. They're living the Christian life as a race. And you started out and you were running good. And then you were hindered. You're sidetracked. You got off track. You quit running. What's the problem? That's the point of Galatians 5. You did run well. Could that be said of any one of us? Forget being leaders, just in our own lives. You were doing good. What happened? So we do that all the time with diets, resolutions, our exercise, our daily Bible reading schedules, our plans, our classes, whatever. You were doing good and then you kind of fizzled. It's easy to do. Starting anything involves excitement. You get excited about starting a project, but then finishing gets quite monotonous. If you've ever built a house, you get started, that's exciting, but before you get through, you'll be tired of it, I guarantee you. You're ready for it to be over. Same thing with other projects that you may have. I found this quite interesting. You may be quite familiar with what this sculpture that's called, or this memorial that's called Scotland's Folly or Edinburgh's Disgrace. This is a war memorial that was built in Edinburgh, Scotland. It was supposed to be a replica of the Parthenon in Athens. They started in 1826. It was supposed to cost £50,000. They were only able to raise $16,000. They started it and they quit in 1829 when the funds ran out, and that's the way it stands today. It was a project that was started but never finished. Well, that's not a bad thing to look at, because that reminds us sometimes we start things that we never get around to finishing, or calculating whether we can even go through with the project. Elders could do that. We're going to do X, Y, Z, and we put it in the plans and then never get around to executing it, or we get started but we never finish that. And so we have to be finishers. Now, let's look at some biblical examples. Good leaders are finishers. Let's look at Joshua. Joshua had the task, since Moses was not allowed to go into the land, his task was to lead the people in the conquest. Let's see how he did. Someone read Joshua 11:15 for me.
Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses.
All right. Joshua was a man, as he was commanded in the conquest. He was to go to the north and to the south, and he was to have the conquest of the middle as well. And the text says, so Joshua did. Joshua did. Did exactly like he was supposed to do. All right, let me make sure I got the right reference for one that's not on the screen. Let's go to Genesis 6:22. I should have put this one on the screen. Noah was a finisher. What was his task? Build an ark. Someone read Genesis 6:22.
Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did.
So he did. I like that phrase. So he did. As God had commanded him, so he did. Just like Joshua. Let's look at another example of a finisher. Solomon. His task was to build what? Temple. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 6 and in not 1 Samuel, that says 1 Kings, which is correct. 1 Kings chapter 6 and in verse 9. And then verse 14. Who has that? Verse 14. Both verses. So he finished it. He started it, he finished it. It's not like that disgrace we saw. He finished it. Nehemiah is another. Started the wall, and how soon did he finish it? 52 days. These are finishers. They start task and they finish it. And so as you look toward the future, you say, I'd like to be a leader. And I've got visions and plans and answers. Great. Work those out and finish those. Because sometimes it may fall on your shoulders, particularly if it was your idea to do something. It may fall on you to do that. It may fall on someone else when their idea was to do X, Y, Z, and you go along with that, but they may be the one that needs to ride herd on getting that accomplished and making sure it gets accomplished. So leaders are finished. Now, Paul, this more is not a task as much as it is living his life. He said, I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. He didn't quit, didn't give up. He was indeed a finisher. Now, finishing is what counts. Why do we say that? You start a task, maybe some instruction you want to teach the church in as a leader, as an elder, or as a group of elders, and you start it, but do you need to finish? Well, finishing is what counts. If it's putting a Bible class program together, you got started, it's looking good, but you never finished, finishing is what counts. You're going to build a building because we need a place to worship, get it started, you need to finish it. That's what counts. Why do we say that? All right, that's when you achieve your goal. An incomplete project doesn't accomplish anything. Very good. Exodus 7 in verse 8 said the end of a thing is better than the beginning. There's a number of applications of that, but that would be one. Finishing a task is better than starting the task, wouldn't it? Finishing the task is better than starting the task because you're done, you're finished. We got to the end, we got the task accomplished. If you don't finish it, then the work is not done. Here was a Jesuit that lived back in 1601 to 1658 that said, the world judges you by what you have done, not what you have started out to do. But what you've completed, not by what you've begun. The bulldog wins by the simple expedient of holding on to the finish. Absolutely. Holding on to the end, not quitting, not giving up. Questions or comments before we go to our solution? Getting the work done. Next time we'll be talking about, and only one lesson on this, characteristics that make people turn to you. What characteristics do leaders need so that people turn to them for leadership? Not everybody has those characteristics. Not every leader has those characteristics. So what characteristics make people want to turn to you for direction and for leadership? We'll talk about that next time. All right, let's talk about this scenario. We only have one for tonight because we are caught up. You're one of 3 elders, and there is some friction between the other 2. It stems from some disagreements, in fact, several times, over matters of judgment. The friction is hampering the decision making on the part of the eldership. What would you do to resolve the problem? So keep in mind, you're one of 3 elders. The other 2 have a little clash, not doctrinal, matters of judgment that they've disagreed over, and it's beginning to build some friction, build between them so that it's hampering decision making. That's a good question. That's a good question. Could it be that he's the problem, the third person in the mix?
Well, if it wasn't 2 elders, if it was 2 members of the church, you would go and have, let's set them all down and discuss it, talk it out.
Okay. Could we do that with the elders?
Go to the other 2 and approach them and see if you can convince all 3 to set it in and talk about the differences of why you are doing what you're doing, why you are going with this side or whatever the argument might be about.
Okay.
See, a lot of times they just don't want to talk. People don't want to talk to somebody that's at odds with them for a reason. If you get them to state why, both of them, then they might just go ahead and leave it at that and be done with it.
All right. I want to come back to that. That's a key to solving this, I think. We'll come back to that. Good point. Good point. Good point.
If it's hampering the decision-making of the eldership, then it's getting to, if not already out of the sin between the two of them, because their example is being viewed by the congregation, their leadership is being viewed by the congregation, and their connection with each other needs to be such that they are able to work together.
Okay, good point. It could reach the point, it may not in this scenario, but it could reach a point that it's reached the point of sinful action between the two that may need to be dealt with. What else would you do? You're the third party in this wheel of three elders, and the other two have some friction between them, matters of judgment.
I would pray with them and for them.
Pray with them and for them. I'm interested in how you would handle it. We're going to drive to a conclusion here in a minute of some things we learned from this. If we're going to be in leadership position, there's some things we need to learn from this. Yes, sir.
If there's matters of conscience involved here, then in that case, we need to err on the side of conservatism. We need to go with the brother who has his conscience bothered. We need to honor that and respect that. If that is a portion of where these matters of judgment are coming from, I think that's something that the three elders should have established from the get-go.
Good point. Good point. Yet generally, maybe I shouldn't say generally, the four elders we have, and this is not them, by the way. This scenario doesn't come from that. Do what? The other three. Yeah. This is not our eldership here. But the four elders that we have, our general function is that if one brother has a problem, even if it's a judgment call, he doesn't like what we're doing, wanting to do, we don't do that. And particularly if it's, can't conscientiously go along with that. So I just don't feel comfortable doing X, Y, Z, well, then we don't do that. Now, if it comes down to a matter of doctrine, we've never reached that point, then we're going to have to deal with something, but not when it's matters of judgment. So, what would you do? You're one of three elders, and you're trying to keep this eldership together and keep the church together. And as I mentioned at the beginning of these studies, these are all either scenarios I've either known personally or I've been told about as I've traveled among brethren. And in this particular case, there was some judgment calls, as I recall, that was hampering the decision between two elders, and then the third man, it kind of felt like it was sitting on his shoulders to try to resolve it. So what do? You're that third man.
A lot of times in these cases, it's generally a lack of understanding or communication. 90% of the time, somebody's going to think something is being done or said because of something they've done, and it may not be that at all.
All right, let's deal with that. Tim commented on that, and Jared has too. So let's talk about that a little bit. Some of you have already mentioned, number one, I would sit down with both men and lay the problem before them. It's reached a point that there is a problem here. And provide, number one, evidence and citing cases. When we tried to deal with this decision, here's what you said to him. And here, when we dealt with this decision, here's what you said back. And there's friction building between the two of you all, and it's hampering our decision. That decision we made on XYZ, we had a hard time getting that accomplished because you two were butting heads. So well established, we've got a problem, and that we might solve this by starting some communication. And so I would suggest, as already been suggested, that the good of the church is at stake. If we don't resolve this church may come apart. The eldership's going to come apart, and it may affect the church. So we get them to communicate. So how are we going to get them to communicate? Because often that is the case. They're not communicating. Caleb?
As far as encouragement to establish from the get-go would be like, we're in the position of eldership. There's no reason why we can't get through this. There shouldn't be a reason unless it's an eldership can't get through this. And that may not happen.
If all three men are qualified, maybe one or maybe two or maybe all three are not qualified, but if all three are qualified, they ought to be able to work through this. They should be calm men of understanding, men of reason, and be able to work through that. You as the third person might serve as a go-between and open up communication. You might start by asking each one to explain their side of the problem. What is your problem with Brother A? What is your problem with Brother B? And get them starting communicating. And you often find as they begin to talk, which they have apparently not been doing, that they will solve that problem themselves. They will resolve that themselves. You might point out some things to them where this one is being unfair, or this one is being stubborn, or you're making assumptions, and help resolve that. What else could you do? We're trying to get them to communicate. We've explained to them the problem may get bigger if we don't resolve it. What else could we do?
That give insight to what the disagreement is, that you can get to with.
Okay. It depends on the nature of what their judgment calls are, what their disagreement is over. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the communication and compromise. On matters of judgment, there needs to be compromise. There's going to have to be. Just like a husband and wife. A husband doesn't get everything he wants. She doesn't get everything she wants. They have to learn to compromise. And the same thing is true in an eldership. Every person who's been an elder for very long recognizes he doesn't get everything he wants. Sometimes he has an idea and the others don't want to go along with that. And sometimes the others want something and he doesn't go along with that, always. And there's no elder would ever say, I always get everything I ever asked for or I suggested. No elder ever does that. No elder has ever done that. And so you have to learn how to compromise, that I'm going to give on this. This is a judgment call. I'm willing to change. And if one is being stubborn and not willing to change, now we've got a problem over stubbornness we've got to deal with. Yes, sir.
You know, we can get back to communication, and a lot of times, you know, we have to be listening with an open ear in order to receive and hear those things that are being said, so we can try to make some changes.
That's right. Good point. All right, let me summarize because our time is about gone and drive to a lesson that we learned, 2 lessons we learned, and then we're going to be done. I've already mentioned we'd sit down with both people is one thing I would suggest, both elders. We might just have a special meeting. We're going to sit down with the 2 elders, and that is I as the 3rd elder, if I happen to be the one, and I'm going to deal with both men and state, here's the problem. Get them to start communicating, but if it gets worse or unable to work the difference out, it may come to the point that I would resign and tell the congregation why I was resigning. That this is not working because we have 2 elders that can't get along, and this is just not working, and so the congregation will help take care of that as a whole. But here's the 2 things that I'm learning that I want you to take away from this. Number 1, there will be times when you as a leader that the problem depends largely on you. This may be a case where, yes, there is an eldership, and you don't make any decisions outside of the eldership agreeing, but there are going to be times where there is some problem may depend largely on you. And I think every elder that we have would agree with that there's sometimes a problem that I'm not the one that needs to deal with that. Larry will say, or will tell Larry, you need to be the one. And it largely lands on him. Sometimes it's George, sometimes it's Mitchell, sometimes it's me. Because of the circumstance, it may largely rely on one person. Does that make sense? And in this case, it relies on this one fella who's going to have to make some decisions how he's going to deal with it because he's not depending on the other 2 because they're the problem. Does that make sense? Here's the second thing you learn. Communication in all problems is the key. You've got to communicate with them. They've got to communicate with each other. And that's the key to resolving the difference. Anything else before we go? We're done.